It's true. I hope that everyone at home right now who's watching, who's tuned in, well, first of all, I'll just say thank you for joining. I know probably the last thing a lot of people are feeling, if you're anything like myself, is like more screen time. I'm certainly getting a little tired of staring at the old laptop these days. So I appreciate everyone tuning in. But, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the climbing world and around the world that's useful to have some good discussion about. So we'll start things out today with a presentation. So we're just going to basically give sort of a lay of the land and then talk a little bit about how COVID-19 is impacting Ontario climbing. Following that, we'll head into a little bit of question and answer sort of period. So we've had a few people who've submitted questions, so we'll cover off a few of those questions and some of the questions that we've had along the way, and then we'll open it up and hopefully be able to take some questions from people. So I'll go through a little bit of a how to use Zoom as part of this. Again, like, forgive me, it's the first time I'm doing this. It's the first time any of us, I think, are doing this. But I'll do my best to make sure that we are able to at least take a few questions and have some discussion. So yeah, I appreciate everyone. So I'll get things started. We're about 4 minutes past, so it's probably time to get rolling on in here. So just off the top, I mean, we're the Ontario Alliance of Climbers, and you're hearing a few panelists on the meeting today as well. So it's myself, Casey Wilson. I've been a board member with the Ontario Alliance of Climbers since about, oh gosh, it's like maybe last summer, I think I joined. The years are blurring now, but I think it was last summer at actually the Rattlesnake Spring Fling, where I was officially brought into the fold. And then, yeah, panelists, do you maybe want to go around? We'll start. Mike, do you want to do a little
Sure.
intro
I was
for
just
yourself?
trying to think how long I've been involved for. I'm not quite sure, but I think for a good, I don't know, 5 years I've been with the OAC. And got involved just through wanting to do a little bit more and wanting to help out where I could, you know, starting back in, I don't know, 2012 or something like that, when we started updating a lot of the crags to make them a little bit more safe and modern. So that was the impetus for me getting involved. And I've been involved ever since. I'm on the board as the co-chair with Randy as well.
Great. Dustin?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin Johnston Jewell. I have been with the OE, or helping out with the board, not on the board, but helping out for the last 4 or 5 years now. I'm not really sure. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks. And Jess?
Hi, I've been volunteering with the OAC for probably 2.5 years now, mostly helping out with social media and helping run events. But yeah.
Awesome. And Pat, I think you're also on the line today.
Yep, hi, I'm Patrick, and I run tech stuff for the OAC and have been working on the board for a number of years, which is probably like 5 or 6.
Nice. Awesome. Great. Okay. So yeah, we're a few of the people who make up part of the OAC, but there are other board members as well who are part of the team. I'll introduce those people as well, even though some of them are not able to join today. But just to kick things off, I'm just going to throw a disclaimer out on the screen. I think it's really important just to be clear that this discussion is really just that, to promote a discussion about COVID as it relates to Ontario climbing. But it's important that you remember, like, the information in this presentation, particularly if you're looking at it after the fact. I mean, this could be out of date at any point, even as we speak. I mean, things are changing so rapidly, and new things are announced by the government and local municipalities almost hourly. So it's really important that you're referring back to those resources for any of the latest information and guidelines and laws related to COVID-19. At the end, as I said, we will have some Q&A period if we can get that rolling. And it's just important to remember that we need to try and be as concise as possible, just to share the space with other people who are attending today, and also just to be polite and respectful. We'll ask that people try to avoid any political commentary. And we have an absolute zero tolerance for any harmful, offensive, or inappropriate language. So if anything like that comes up, we wouldn't hesitate to have people removed, and we really hope and expect that won't be an issue today. So just lay those ground rules out from the beginning. I did a terrible job taking a few screen grabs just to show everyone how Zoom works. I know there's a lot of people who probably don't use it, maybe are not familiar with the tool. But you can see if you hover over the bottom of your window, you'll see a mute, stop video. You might not have all these controls as a participant, but you'll definitely see polling and Q&A. And also if you click the more button, you'll see a chat window. And just be aware that when you're chatting in that window, you have a choice between all panelists versus all panelists and attendees. So that just chooses the audience for who the chat is. So just be mindful that if you are putting something in that window, it's possible everyone can see it, unless you choose otherwise. So just be mindful of that. Otherwise, hopefully, it should be pretty straightforward. So as I was saying, we actually have 6 Ontario Alliance of Climbers board members, but recently we had a departure, or someone who will be departing. Leslie Timms will no longer be with the OAC. So we will be looking to fill that role at some point. But in the meantime, we do have 5 active members. Randy Kilbasavich, Mike Penny, who's on the line today, Pat Lamb, who's also on the line, Mike Masachek, and myself, Casey Wilson. And then an enormous handful of very keen volunteers who help with things like volunteer coordination, and Jess and Dustin are obviously both very involved in terms of social media management and volunteer engagement and whatnot, and helping support all kinds of things. We have monthly board meetings, and there are a few people who are really engaged in those meetings as well, who we're really grateful to have as people who are contributing. So we're a provincial and nonprofit organization, so all board members are volunteers. And we work to secure and protect climbing access through advocacy, education, and stewardship. We started out, for those who don't know, as the Ontario Access Coalition, and we rebranded to the Ontario Alliance of Climbers because it really became important to share that access work is so much more than something done by a few volunteers behind closed doors. It really is something that we all as a climbing community need to engage in. Part of the work that we do with that goal in mind is collaboration with landowners and land managers. So we work on access guidelines with land managers. We handle issues as they may arise. So if there's any access related issues, we'll help address those things as a climbing community with the landowners and land managers, and that could be for public and private land. We also have special projects and special events that we work on, such as the garlic pull, which is a photo that you see here. So this photo is from one of the garlic pulls that we've done in Halton Conservation Area. We do things like organize Niagara Glen cleanup days and other special events, such as the Rattlesnake Spring Fling and also the Beaver Valley Climbing Festival. And part of that is all funneling in towards climbing community outreach and education. So as I was saying, access is something that we all need to contribute to. And part of that is engaging with the climbing community so that we can all understand our role as climbers and how we impact climbing access. So I've given a bit of a brief summary of who we are, just for those who are not aware. But today the focus of the conversation is really about the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on Ontario climbing. So we're going to talk about that in detail today. So just as far as the current state, I mean, I think most people know this by now, but we're still in a declaration of emergency, so a state of emergency across Ontario, and that can vary by different provinces. But we are still very much in a state of emergency in Ontario. And the Ontario emergency orders, so any rules as a result of that, or any laws or guidelines as a result of that declaration of emergency, are still in effect until May 6th. And these things, again, they can change at any time. There's also localized states of emergencies in various cities and townships across the province. So it's important to remember that local municipalities can decide whether or not they are in a state of emergency, which allows them to enact various measures in response to the emergency orders, or the declaration of emergency. So at this point, it looks like in Ontario, the government is certainly reporting that we are, thankfully, flattening the curve. However, the government has also reinforced that we need to continue with social distancing or physical distancing practices and adhering to those emergency orders, such as staying out of parks and amenities and whatnot, to help continue with flattening that curve and hopefully squashing this virus as soon as possible. The Ontario emergency orders were extended to May 6th, so those things include things like distancing, not gathering in groups of larger than 5 except at essential service locations. It also includes the closure of any non-essential businesses and the closure of recreational parks and amenities, so that can include parks, off-leash dog parks, playgrounds, etc. So it's very important to remember that these emergency orders are still in place. And I would say at this point, it's probably likely they'll be extended, but that's only speculation at this point. So as part of the emergency orders and the emergency declaration, Ontario Parks has announced that they will remain closed until May 31st. So this was just announced a couple days ago. Which means that any of the Ontario Parks climbing areas are also closed. It's important to remember that not all climbing areas are Ontario Parks land. However, we need to be really mindful of what our role is as climbers in both public and private lands, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But in addition to the Ontario Parks closures, you can see, places like the Bruce Trail have also said that we are closing and we're asking people to stay away. And really, this is what we're seeing across the board. I mean, certainly across the province of Ontario. Many parks, any managed parks with land management structures are certainly asking people to stay away, with some parks available for walkthrough access only. And it's important to remember that walkthrough access really is passive walkthrough access. That's literally walking through the park. And they're very specifically asking people not to touch things and whatnot while they're there. So all Ontario parks are closed, and that is effective until May 31st. Niagara Parks is not technically an Ontario park, though it does fall under Ontario Parks, but they have opted also to close and not given an official date for their reopening. So for the time being, the Glen is absolutely closed. However, they are not able to close the park. They don't have like a gate mechanism there and can't necessarily prevent people from going into the Glen, and they recognize that. So they have still been asking people, just please stay away if you can. And they are ramping up enforcement there to ask people to abide by the social distancing measures and avoiding gathering in groups and whatnot. Halton Region Conservation Area is also not an Ontario park. It does not fall under Ontario Parks, and they actually have their own agency to decide whether or not they would be open and closed. They're certainly eager to reopen as everyone as soon as safe to do so. However, they have also decided to close, and I'm sure many of you saw that in the news, with their parking lots being very full, and so they had no choice but to close because social distancing measures were just not being followed. So that is another area that is closed at this time. So that kind of covers some of the more popular climbing destinations. So, I mean, Halton region, obviously, including things like Rattlesnake, the Niagara Glen being closed. Some people have had questions about whether the Niagara Glen includes Campton. So Campton, I will address, which is not sanctioned for climbing. I will say it's tolerated, but not sanctioned. So climbing is technically not allowed in Camden. However, Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority has officially closed all parks. So, and Campton falls in there as well. So if you're looking for loopholes, that's not the place to do it. And we certainly don't encourage that. So sorry, go ahead.
Just wondering if you could comment on existing crags that are already closed. Are those still closed?
They're still closed.
Okay, just checking.
So I think I reiterated that in here again, but yeah, so crags that are closed to climbing are still closed to climbing. So if you're going to places that are closed, you are breaking the rules to begin with, and you are potentially going to do a really great job of making a very poor name for rock climbers. And I think I mentioned that again a little bit later, but just to reiterate, and I've said this a few times, if anyone's part of the Niagara Glen Facebook group, you've probably seen my comments about this and maybe been confused or not, but we have to remember this is not a climbing ban. And it's important to understand the distinction because climbing bans are specifically bans on climbing, targeting climbers. And we don't want those. We don't want to see climbing bans enacted in any of our crags across Ontario because one, it reduces our options for climbing when regulations around COVID are lifted, but they're also very difficult to remove. So, you know, one of the risks of a climbing ban, for example, is if you have someone, you know, a park that enacts a climbing ban and the COVID regulations are lifted and say they get busy with other things and that climbing ban remains intact and we have a hard time, you know, either getting the attention to have it removed or maybe someone changes roles for that management group. That could be really challenging for us. So we really have to remember it's not a climbing specific ban. However, climbing is not permitted due to the COVID regulations across provincial parks. So there's the obvious question of, well, what does that mean for places that are not provincial parks? You know, places such as the Turtle, which is also closed despite COVID-19, but places like that, does it mean that, you know, if climbing were allowed there, regardless of COVID-19, could we climb there? Well, no, we don't want people climbing in places that are closed at all right now. We don't want people climbing anywhere for obvious reasons, well, what seem to be obvious reasons, but it's just important to remember the language that we're using and be mindful that, you know, if you're trying to call places, for example, you know, there were a few reports of people calling the Niagara Glen and asking, hey, is climbing still allowed there? If they get that question enough, they're going to think, do we need to enforce a climbing specific ban or make a climbing ban so that it's very clear to people that climbing is not allowed? Well, we really don't want that to happen. So I think we just need to be mindful about that. Yeah, I don't know, Mike, anything else to add to that specific comment?
No, I think you've covered it off really well in terms of not wanting to communicate it as a ban per se. It's really just about the general recreational activities that are happening, you know, in parks and in our beloved areas. So we need to unfortunately refrain from doing those things for a period of time. And I think you hit it, you mentioned it at the start of all of this, which is really around, you know, we're doing a great job so far, at least in Ontario, in flattening the curve. I think what we tend to forget is that sometimes flattening the curve doesn't really mean that it goes away any quicker. And we're still going to be, unfortunately, subject to some of these rules and some of this way of life we've adopted for a little while yet. We're all eager to get climbing, and we'll get there together soon, hopefully, but not right now.
Yep. And so where some of the parks are struggling with enforcement, like they're certainly ramping up. They're ramping up enforcement with local police. So Niagara Parks, for example, I'd still seen a lot of people going to the Glen, and thankfully, based on my understanding, it's not climbers who are there. I was really happy to hear that. It's actually hikers and whatnot. So I'm pretty pleased to hear that. But it is important to know that they are ramping up enforcement, and there are fines as well. So, I mean, an individual could be fined anywhere from $750 to $1,000 for not adhering to emergency orders. There could also be a fine of anywhere up to $100,000 in certain cases. And for corporations, so if you're a guiding company, for example, you could be at risk of a fine anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. So these are really important things to keep in mind. And as I said, like it would be a really great time to make a really bad name for rock climbers by trying to test some of those rules. So I grabbed a little snippet here from an article that I found. This was in New Zealand, I want to say, where someone was thrown into the news for basically just testing the emergency lockdown and climbing. And he was, basically publicized as being someone who didn't care about other people and was going against the rules. And, it's just really unfortunate to see things like that. And I'm excited and happy that we're not having those issues here, because it would be so, it is up to every individual to follow the rules, just like, following the rules of the road and whatnot, right? And it's, I mean, I understand, like you said, Mike, there's so many people who are eager to get out there. I mean, we all are, but we really just have to be as selfless as possible at a time like this. And to the earlier point, I mean, closed crags are still closed. So Grand River Conservation Authority, this would be Rockwood. So if you're still trying to climb at Rockwood at a time like this, I mean, that's a really great way to make a terrible name for climbers. And it's important for people to understand that all of the conservation authorities, they speak to each other. So Grand River Conservation Authority knows everyone over at Halton Conservation Authority. Like we're making a reputation for ourselves every time we go out and climb. So I think that's just something that we need to be mindful of as a community.
Great point, Casey.
Thanks. Yeah, anything else to add there? I think it's, it's hard to take that kind of tone, but it's important to remember, this is a really big deal. We're talking about a global pandemic here, right? This isn't just access in a climbing area anymore, right? This is about more than just rock climbing. And I think we have to keep that perspective.
I would just, I guess, layer on that a little bit. If we're making the case for anybody who's otherwise unconvinced as to the reasons to stay home despite our yearning for the outdoors, especially as the weather gets better, it's important to consider that we're not, for many of us that are active, we're likely not going to be necessarily the highest risk group, but we're learning more and more about this virus every day. And it sounds to me like there's a lot of indications that we need to act as if we are potential spreaders of the virus. And that's an important mindset, I think, to take. The reason for wearing a mask, as suggested when we go out. And I think for our purposes, the reason why we should refrain as well from not traveling to climbing areas. I'll just use an example that sort of would hit close to home for me. You talk about a community like Lion's Head that has a large part of their small town, both literally, I suppose, as well as financially tied to an old age home. And we all, I think, have seen the news in terms of how deadly this virus can be once it gets inside a location like that. So there's other things to consider beyond us spreading the virus at the crag or with our partners or through the touch of other things that we're touching along the way. I think it's important for us to consider the greater picture and remind ourselves that despite our, levels of misery, maybe I'm speaking for myself, that it's worth it in the end to make the sacrifice. And, you know, we're likely going to look back on this years from now and think with rose-colored glasses that this was a nice time when the world stopped. You know, right now it's not too pleasant, but hopefully we'll get back to business sooner than later. And that's all done, like I said, we are collective in our approach.
I can also welcome Randy Gabeshewicz and Mike Makishak, who are also on the call. If you could make them panelists, Casey.
Yep.
These are our other board members.
Randy, you should be able to say hello.
He's still on mute. Bottom left, Randy.
Hello.
Hey.
There you go.
Hey. Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
how's it going?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. All right. Okay, so we'll head to the next slide. So we had talked about a little bit about public and private land. And just to clarify, it's just important to remember that all the cities and townships, they can enforce their bylaws. They have the right to enforce their bylaws as they choose, and choose whether or not they are in a state of emergency and whatnot. And so it's just important to remember, you know, even as sanction or, you know, as regulations lift, it's important that we pay attention, we pay close attention to what's happening in the different areas, because they can change at different paces. And at a time like this, like those private landowners really need our support as well. They don't have, you know, the conservation authorities or the land management teams that some of the Ontario parks have, or some of the other local parks like Niagara Parks Commission has. And so those private landowners really need us as a community to take responsibility for ourselves and stay away from those climbing areas. So that's just something something to keep in mind as a community, that again, like we're representing climbers every time we go out, and if we're going to go against the rules and try to bend the rules, you know, we have to be mindful of who we're impacting and how that's going to come across and what the risks are as well. So I think if you're considering climbing, I think you really have to think about this outside of just the sport of rock climbing, and how this impacts our greater community as residents of Ontario and Canada and the world. So what are we doing at this time? So all of this is going on. What is the OAC doing? So we are still active as a board. We still have monthly board meetings. We're doing them virtually now. And so we still meet regularly to communicate all of these things, and to stay on top of communications with each other among the board, and then also with our external stakeholders. And those stakeholders include landowners and land managers. We also work with the ACC, so the Alpine Club of Canada, specifically the Toronto chapter. So John Vallone, we're very grateful to have him as an active volunteer with the OAC. He is also a board member, or he is a board member with the ACC, and he participates in a lot of the OAC discussions. So we've been in close contact with them as well. And we try to reach out often. You know, I specifically, both as a board member and a portfolio manager for the Niagara Glen, reach out on, you know, almost a bi-weekly basis to the Niagara Parks Commission, just to ask if everything is okay there, if they need additional support from the OAC, or if there's any issues. You know, if they start to see a surge in rock climbers there when we're not supposed to be down there, I would be the person that they would reach out to about that. And I just want to stay on top of those kinds of things so that we don't end up with a climbing ban. That's one of the biggest concerns that I have, because we have gone through a history of bans in the Glen and other places across Ontario. So it's definitely something that we're mindful of. And also the monitoring, the ongoing monitoring of the provincial and federal and municipal guidelines around COVID-19. So as those things change, we're trying to stay on top of that, and we've seen new things develop each day with that. So that's something that we really have to continue to do to stay informed and make sure that we're sharing the right information with the climbing community. So you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and also on our website. If for any of that information, we'll try to stay as up to date as possible. And we also try to exchange and share information with other access groups. So I recently attended a virtual meeting through the CWA, which is the Climbing Wall Association. They host virtual meetings, and one of those meetings was with the Access Fund. So I was able to join that meeting and just get some information about how things are going down in the US, because obviously being our very close neighbor, that can impact us as well. And it's also a great way to get ideas for how we might deal with some of the challenges that we're facing now, and some of those challenges we may face as we prepare for what we'll refer to as the new normal. The other thing is just sharing some of the access information around other locations across Ontario and some of the areas we know that are popular for Ontario climbers to travel to. So you're seeing a photo from the Glen on the very left side, which is very local to us. This is Squamish in the middle, and if you've been following the Facebook group up there, you've been well aware of the closures going on there. And this is on the right side from the Red River Gorge. So just trying to stay on top of everything and make sure that we have the information we can share with people. Anything else to add there?
I just add that Red River Gorge is Ontario's best crag.
It was actually the first place I ever went rock climbing. It's kind of spoiled, I guess, but I guess that's pretty typical nowadays. So that's some of the stuff that the OAC is doing, but what can we do as climbers? So as we know, access is so much more than just what we do as the OAC. It's actually it's very largely what we do as an entire community. So for climbers, it's like we really all need to continue staying home, avoiding non-essential travel, practicing physical distancing. So you'll hear social versus physical distancing. I think physical distancing is becoming a bit more of a common term, because we all feel a little bit more isolated in our homes, and we have to remember it's still important to connect with each other. But we need to really, avoid testing the rules. We've certainly heard rumors of people who have been trying to test the rules by climbing in areas outdoors now, and it's disappointing to hear that, but there's always going to be bad actors, unfortunately. And I mean, maybe that's a bit defeatist to say. I hope that we wouldn't have bad actors, but it does happen. But we are aware of those things going on, and we do hear from the land managers and landowners about those people, and so it's something that we're certainly keeping an eye on. But it's important to remember, the more we try to test those rules, the more likely it is that we will end up with climbing bans. And climbing bans are really bad things. They are really challenging to lift. And anyone who's been around since the 90s is well aware of some of the challenges we've faced, certainly in the Glen, and others could probably speak to some of the other areas, but it's definitely something we want to avoid. So as much as we can avoid testing the rules, that would be great. And if you are hearing of friends who are maybe talking about climbing or thinking about going climbing, or maybe they are going climbing right now, try to speak to those people. It's important to always address people with empathy, but I think at the same time, we need to be firm that this is not the time to be trying to test those limits. So yeah, overall, be responsible and be respectful to our community. I mean, if one person starts testing the rules and gets an area closed, that can potentially ruin it for a lot of people. And Janie Midges once said it very well, that a climbing ban means that we no longer have those places to create memories with our friends, and to send our projects and spend our weekends. So I think it's really something that we need to take very seriously. And remember that there's people who are making real sacrifices out there. You know, personally, this is very close to me. I have a sister who works in the COVID unit, and it's very important to me that she is well and safe, and the less people who are potentially transmitting this virus, the better. So it's important to respect those people. I'm sure many people on here, and I know in the climbing community as well, we have a lot of people who work in healthcare. And so it's important to be respectful to those people by doing our part. And staying up to date. So, you know, following along with what the OAC is sharing, but also what the government shares, and taking the long view. Find other outlets. Like Dustin, you had a lot to say around that. I think everyone's starting to, you know, get really familiar with their hangboards. So, you know, it's frustrating. It's frustrating for all of us, especially as the weather gets nicer. It's even more frustrating. You know, there's people I know, you know, friends who've been training for an entire year to get on a project outside this year, or maybe more than that. You know, we've been waiting a long time, and it's frustrating not to be able to do that, but we really need to take the long view and be patient. Climbing will be around for a long time, and I know that it gets harder, you know, over the years as an older climber myself, but you know, it's something that we have to do if we want to climb again, and become an OAC member. So, you know, this is someone said knitting in the in the Zoom window. I'm not that talented, but become an OAC member if you can. You know, it is a $5 lifetime membership. I know finances can be challenging for people at this time. But having a large membership base really helps us when it comes to access work, especially with negotiations. The larger the membership base we have, the more willing people will be to listening to what we have to say. So it's helpful when people become members, and it also means that we have a connection to individuals within the community, and we're able to share information as we have it. So it's a great way to stay connected and support access work. Anything else anyone wants to add there?
No, but if anyone's running out of things to knit, I'll gladly take some chalk bags. I'm always losing them.
A knitted chalk bag? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I guess I've seen those.
it would be
before.
incentive not to lose it as well.
Yes, yes. I guess I've seen those.
So people
Okay.
have questions about what to do when they know about people who are actually climbing. This is an excellent question, and look, like telling people, "Hey, dude, don't go climbing," is not necessarily the most effective way to come at it. Like I would encourage trying to have a conversation with these people, and not like telling people to do stuff is maybe not the most effective thing, but try to like ask them, well, you know, have you thought through about the consequences of doing this and what could possibly happen? It's tough.
I think Casey kind of addressed that pretty well in suggesting, first of all, that we need to approach anybody who is climbing. I think we need to assume that perhaps they're just not aware of the full extent of the risks. I know that I was once quite new to the sport and very, you know, very keen to get out there, rain or shine. And I think it's important for us to just approach it with some empathy and some understanding that perhaps they're just not fully aware of what's at stake, and you know, try to go through the reasons why it's not a great idea to be doing that right now. And if they need any additional resources, they can certainly reach out to any one of us, and we'd be happy to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just reinforce too, I mean, it only works for someone to be able to go climbing right now if no one else goes climbing. Because if you can imagine everyone who wanted to go climb, I always use the Glen because I'm the boulderer, so sorry, that's the example you get. But you know, if everyone who wanted to climb in the Glen right now went down and climbed there, it would be impossible to social distance. I mean, never mind the fact that we're not allowed to use the Glen for anything other than walkthrough access. Who that is. But anyone who, you know, if everyone who wanted to go climb in the Glen went and climbed there, it would be impossible to follow social distancing rules. you know, and so it only makes it, yes, the Danzig boulder would be crazy, but it would be impossible. So, you know, we've heard of people climbing in places, you know, and sport climbing in different places. And again, like, you might think that it's okay, but it's only okay, well, it's not even okay, because it's just, frankly, in my opinion, selfish, and I will just say that. But you know, it only works if no one else does it, right? So if climbing was allowed at a crag and everyone started going there, you wouldn't be able to follow the emergency orders that are in place. So it's, unfortunately, it just doesn't work. So, and some people just maybe don't think about that or don't realize that. So it's just important to keep that in mind. You know, and there's also things like risk of injury. If you know, if you do get injured and you need to go to a hospital, you're just taking up more room in a hospital that doesn't need any more strain right now. And also there's things like, you know, to get to certain places, you might need to stop for gas, and you're potentially exposing people at a small gas station, you know, to COVID, because we know that you can be an asymptomatic carrier. So, you know, it's just not a good idea right now. It's not safe, it's not smart, and it's not mindful of other people. So it's really important to keep that in mind. So yeah, and as we said, I mean, look, anyone who thinks that it's a good idea to try and test the rules, like, there is proof that access is a privilege in Ontario. We've dealt with climbing bans, and we've dealt with the threat of climbing bans across the Niagara Escarpment and in the Glen and other places. Halfway Log Dump was even closed at one point. So it's really important to remember that, you know, we have access, like, access is essentially in our hands. If we can be respectful, then we can maintain access to the places that are open right now. So yeah, so that's what we'll say about that. Right now, Ontario has just started looking at reopening. So this is something, when we talk about the new normal, this information just came out on Monday, and it's very preliminary. Anyone who looked at the plan can see it's very general. And it probably intentionally vague, which I think makes sense. But basically, Ontario was looking at a 3-stage plan for gradually reopening, and it's impossible to say with any certainty when that might be. So I think we just, again, we need to be patient, but at this point, it looks like outdoor spaces will be opened as part of stage 2. However, we don't know what capacity they would be opened in. And again, Ontario parks can make their decisions. Niagara parks can make their decision. Underneath Ontario parks, Halton Conservation can make their own decision independent of Ontario parks. And then any private land would be affected by the general emergency orders or social distancing regulations, etc. So, so lots of people have asked when can we climb again? And the answer, to be completely candid, is we don't know. So we just need to keep staying up to date on the information as it's released and understand. And I think something that we also need to be mindful of is, you know, we need to look at the information that is released and look at that with a discerning eye as rock climbers and say, okay, if restrictions are lifted and we're allowed to go climb in places, like, should we, you know, we'll have to think about that as a community. And maybe that's something we can talk about as part of the question and answer period here. So that's just a little bit of information about that plan. You can find that plan on ontario.ca. As I said, it's very vague at this point. And maybe for a bit of a sneak peek into what our future could potentially look like, Saskatchewan has opened up a little bit more of a detailed plan. Some people are asking just about rockheads and gyms closing. No gyms in Toronto are open at this time. No gyms are allowed to be open. So right now, that's the status of that. No gyms are open, and we don't know at what point they would be allowed to be open.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that if you look at the Saskatchewan detailed plan, recreation indoor and outdoor areas are in the later stages of their plan. So stage 4 out of I think 5 stages. So
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that the gyms will be closed for a while longer.
Yeah.
If I can just add, hi guys, it's Dustin. So I think a big kind of umbrella to think about this as we move forward is that whatever life looks like for the next X number of months is not going to be, unfortunately, what life looked like 3 months ago. And so there's going to, like, on top of the rules by the parks and the conservation areas and the province and the country, there's going to be new social norms that will be carried into our day-to-day life, whether that's work, whether that's social life, and that also will include climbing. So it's hard to say for certain what that will look like right now. Obviously, I think Casey's really well articulated that, but there will be new social norms at the crags when we visit them. There will be new social norms when we go to hang out in these places we love, and we're going to have to carry that through as a community and be the best stewards we can.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been part of the Climbing Wall Association calls, and there's certainly discussion about what the new normal might look like in climbing gyms. And I can imagine some of that being carried out into the crags. One of the discussion is mask wearing. Should we be wearing masks as climbers if we are allowed to go back into outdoor spaces again? So those are the kinds of discussions that we would need to have as a community. And I mean, certainly the OAC is not here to enforce, like we are not an enforcement body. I think that's fair to say. However, we certainly would communicate what we feel are the best recommendations for the climbing community to be safe, and certainly, any regulations that are enforced by the government. So, anything? I don't know. Is that accurate to say? Does anyone else say something different?
The only thing I would layer on top of that, I suppose, is just tempering our expectations that, when parks open, they're likely going to open in stages. And so, I think we've talked it around in circles now, but it's quite possible that certain activities will be allowable in parks or in public lands. But it is up to the land managers to decide what gets opened, how it gets opened, and to what user groups. So I think we need to be prepared for that.
Great. So yeah, new normal. I mean, we've kind of been talking about this already, but I think, we will see the gradual lifting of restrictions. And I think some people are mentioning in the chat right now, the New Brunswick. And yeah, that's definitely been posted. You can find the article on Grip. I think John Ballone posted that. Thank you, John. But New Brunswick has talked about the the guidelines for climbing outdoors, and the OAC is certainly paying attention to what other areas are doing, but also deciding, what is right for Ontario climbing. New Brunswick is a smaller community than Ontario. Some of the crags here in Ontario can see, reports of Nemo on the weekend can be anywhere from 200 people a day or more. So I think we have to be mindful that we're a really dense population here in Ontario while we have a fair amount of crags, those crags are heavily used. So, our normal might look a bit different, or our lifting of restrictions or guidelines for climbing outside might look a bit different than what we see in New Brunswick or other smaller areas. So that's something to be mindful of. And climbing gyms also are not necessarily going to be fully opening as they had before. As you said, Dustin, I mean, our life before COVID is not going to look the same. I say after COVID, but that's not really the right phrase. I mean, it's kind of in a new COVID present world. But if gyms are not able to fully open and park restrictions are lifted, will we see a surge of climbers heading outdoors, potentially having crags be much more busy than they already are? the Glen is very popular already. We've already seen some, crowding at Lion's Head and other places. Are we going to see more of that as restrictions are lifted and climbing gyms are not necessarily able to open fully to their full to the full capacity that they had been operating at? So these are some of the things that we are going to need to keep an eye out for. And those changing habits, as I said earlier, like, do we need to consider mask wearing when we're climbing outdoors? Are we using hand sanitizer between attempts or what have you? So those are the kinds of things that we're going to need to be thinking about. Anything else to add to that?
Liquid chalk has alcohol in it.
It does, and there's been some initial discussion. I've heard a bit of discussion about liquid chalk and whether or not it's appropriate for disinfection. And I would say, based on what I've heard, the research is still out. The alcohol level would have to be so high in the chalk that in most cases, a lot of the products that are out there, the alcohol content just isn't high enough.
I'm going to second what Casey's saying there. The CEC, Climbing Ethical Lab Canada, has created a task force to basically assess how gyms can go about reopening into this, and they are looking specifically at that. And right now, it doesn't look like liquid chalk is strong enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not.
Don't inject it.
No, don't inject it. Oh gosh.
Lauren Chan for the win.
And no, don't drink it either.
But guys, I'd really like to see what that does when you put it in the body,
Oh gosh. Didn't we say we weren't going to have any political commentary?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. We'll let it slide that time. But no, don't ingest it. No funny ideas like that. But yeah, at this point, like, the preliminary info is basically it would not be high enough. Look, my sister works in a COVID unit, and I've said to her, before, hey, would you wash your hands with liquid chalk afterwards? And her answer was basically like, yeah, no, definitely not. So, it's not, I think it's something that we have to avoid thinking. Like, it's tempting to jump on these ideas, and yes, like, it's great that people are exploring these different ideas, but I think we just really have to be careful not to spread potentially dangerous information if it's not accurate or have been proven. I think we need to be really careful of that as a community. It's in this day and age, it's like we're all so hungry for information, and I think that unfortunate reality is that we're just still kind of learning about this virus at this stage still. So I think, I would just caution anyone to jump on anything they've kind of heard through the grapevine, and really look to reputable resources for answers. And certainly we'll do our best as we hear new information come out, we'll try to distribute that as quickly as possible. I'm trying to stay in touch with people who are, attempting to do some research on things like that, and hopefully somebody comes up with a new idea, but at this point I would not rely on liquid chalk. That's not necessarily something that you could rely on right now. So yeah, I think those are the kinds of questions that we would ask of the climbing community is, what does a new normal look like to you? What role do you think the OAC has in managing the reopening of climbing? What would a phased approach look like to you as climbers? And would you abide by things like voluntary restrictions on the number of climbers in an area? A permit system perhaps for places like the Glen, I mean, there's a permit system there, but would we be willing to accept a limitation on the number of people that could go to a place like that? And we're not posing these questions because they're things that we're, exploring at this point, but I think it's something that we need to be at least discussing now and starting to consider. So those are the kinds of things we'll open up in the Q&A. There were a few questions that came through before today's meeting, and so I'll just share some of those questions. One person, Jenny, asked about guiding companies. She was asking if they would be able to work this summer. So And again, I mean, unfortunately, the answer for a lot of the stuff is just that we don't know. And I think that's the case here. I think until we see what those lifting of restrictions look like, it's really hard to say whether or not guiding companies would be able to work this summer. At this point, you know, my gut tells me it would be optimistic, but again, we can't say for sure. And then I think the question comes back to, again, when restrictions are lifted, how do we interpret those restrictions as rock climbers? I mean, we all kind of saw the slow evolution of things back when this pandemic first began. And climbing wasn't banned yet at the Glen, but as a community, you know, the rumblings kind of came up, and as a community, we sort of decided it wasn't right to climb at the Glen even before the Glen asked people not to go there. So, you know, I think we need to hear the restrictions that are given, or the lifting of the restrictions as they come, and really think about those as a community beyond, you know, what is and isn't allowed. What do we feel is right as a climbing community? And also knowing that we are the subject matter experts when it comes to rock climbing. We understand rock climbing and the nature of, you know, what it's like to belay someone, and you know, what's required in the case of an emergency evac or what have you, right? So we understand those things well, and, you know, the Ontario government isn't necessarily knowledgeable about the intricacies of rock climbing. So when restrictions are lifted, again, we just need to think about those in the context of climbing and what we really think makes sense. So one other person, Amma Balama, who may or may not be a real llama, asked, as a climbing community, it's a llama photo on the person's Instagram, they messaged me. So that person asked, how can we as a community reduce the strain on smaller communities such as Lion's Head, given that they have limited hospital beds, etc.? We talked a little bit about this, but, you know, all the municipalities and townships, like, they are all handling things a little bit differently. They have the right to enforce bylaws and emergency orders locally. But at this point, it is important to remember, like, the premier has asked and not told and not restricted travel to cottage country and similar places, but they have asked that we don't go to cottage country. You know, my family has a cottage up in Parry Sound, and we're specifically not going there because we don't want to potentially unknowingly infect people up there, or potentially get injured while we're at the cottage and have to go to a small hospital that's already strained. So those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. But ultimately, we would be following the lead of those municipalities and townships. So, you know, at this point, I think it's safe to say that we should be staying away. But again, we'd follow the lead of those local communities and any other restrictions that are given. So hopefully that answers that question. Lena asked, are we working with other access groups? Yes, we are. We're working with, locally, we work with the Alpine Club of Canada. John Vallone is here today as well. He's in the chat. You can say hi to him. But we do work with the Alpine Club of Canada in regards to access issues. And also, as I mentioned, I have been on calls with the Access Fund down in the US, and certainly getting updates from other areas, and we'll share them as they come out as well. So we've just kind of been in the initial stages of researching what reopening might look like and what reopening guidelines might look like for outdoor climbing. So we still have a little bit more work to do there, but it's definitely something that we've started. It's in progress. And I think it's really important to say too that we need to be mindful, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, but we need to be mindful that restrictions may be lifted differently in all different places, and we need to respect those. We need to respect those restrictions. And be mindful of our impact too. So if, for example, you know, and we're not in this situation right now, but if Ontario had a significantly more number of cases than in the US, and restrictions were lifted in the US, I don't think it's appropriate as Ontario climbers to go travel to the US, and vice versa, right? So I think we just need to be mindful that even if restrictions are lifted in other places and we can, you know, we're allowed to go climbing in places like Lion's Head, for example, or allowed to go climbing in Halton Conservation Area, should we? You know, I live in downtown Toronto personally. I live in a high-rise building. The probability of me coming into contact with someone with COVID is much higher than someone who lives in a smaller area. So is it responsible for me to go climbing somewhere if a restriction is lifted elsewhere? Probably not. So again, you need to use your own judgment and you know, and do what is ultimately right and respectful of our community and our fellow Ontarians and Canadians. So those were a few of the initial questions that came up. Anyone else in the panel have questions that were posed to them?
There's a question in the chat here about Crown land.
So I think that's another one where I would almost treat Crown land as a private property in a way, in the respect that there isn't necessarily formal land management telling you can't go there. But I think that we need to be smart about whether or not we're going to places like that. I don't know if there's an official announcement. John, if I can add you here as a panelist, maybe you can speak to that.
You did.
Jessica and John pointed these out in the chat as well. So Jessica pointed out that green spaces that are not explicitly closed are still open to the public, are open for walkthrough access only.
Walkthrough only, okay, yeah.
Which means no climbing.
No climbing.
Wah wah.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, it makes sense. I understand it. John, I'm going to throw you in as a, oh, whoops, did I just unshare my screen? I'll throw you in as a panelist here in case you wanted to add something to that. So John, you should be able to unmute yourself and add to that if you'd like. No pressure.
Sure. So I just posted a link in the chat that everyone can take a look at, but effectively there's no camping allowed on Crown land. And otherwise I would treat it as standard green space rules until we hear otherwise. And the same is, quite frankly, the same is true for nature reserves in Ontario. So that would be places like Lion's Head. Those are kind of treated like provincial parks under our legislation. So the ban in Ontario parks would also apply to places like Lion's Head for our perspective.
So Sabrina Chapman in the chat asks, would you please speak to experienced climbers who are still going out and don't do it, right? That's the answer right now in Ontario. Right?
Yeah, I think we touched on this. I think overall the comments that Casey shared in the midst of the presentation there are applicable to everybody. I did see an earlier comment talking about rhetoric as it pertains to new climbers, and that might have been me. So I apologize if it came off that way. This is stuff that applies to everybody.
My dad made bread and he put too much yeast in it.
Sorry, anyway. So yeah, so as it stands, the stuff that we're sharing with you today is for everybody. If you know there are some climbers that should know better, you still need to have those conversations if you can around why they shouldn't be out there and what the multitude of reasons are that they should be respectful of the rules and of our current situation.
The other question that came up was what happens later on when the outdoors opens and the indoors is not open, and it's complicated, right? Because if someone doesn't know what they're doing and gets themselves hurt outdoors, that's really bad. But we don't want to be elitist and say, you know, only experienced climbers. But I think personally, not speaking for the OAC, there's going to be some sort of adjustment period and some sort of phasing in where people can gain experience with climbing in a safe way, perhaps with the help of our guiding companies.
I don't know if you want to take that, Casey, or me, but I would just say in regards to that, it's not about experienced versus new climbers. This is about the guidelines that are being provided to us by all the various land managers, by the government. And when there comes a time when potentially there is outdoor climbing available to us and indoor climbing is not, yes, we're going to have to be mindful about how we're participating in this sport, in this new norm. And I would venture to say that most people have some sense of what that means for them, what that's going to look like for them, and their own gauge for how risk tolerant they are from both, contracting the virus standpoint as well as their own safety. So it's not about, I don't anticipate a rush of new climbers out there. And certainly we don't have enough data to even suggest that new climbers are disproportionately hurt than elite climbers, quote unquote. It's not about that. It's really about, let's wait and see what the various land managers have built for us, and we will work with them as best we can when it comes to the time when we're allowed to participate again. But as I said earlier, I think we're likely going to see some phased integration or, continuation of activity. So we're really going to have to wait and see. And I think these are all the things that parks, land management, and recreation areas are thinking about right now. How do they help stem the growth or potential growth of the virus while still trying to provide as much access and enjoyment to all of us along the way?
Yeah, and keeping their staff safe as well there on site. I mean, you have certain places where there are on-site facilities like washrooms and, the nature center at the Glen, for example, or parking meters and all that kind of stuff. So we just have to think about all the things that we interact with too. And I think that they'll be thinking about that as well and how they can make those things safer. I just want to come back quickly to Sabrina's question about experienced climbers who are still climbing right now. We haven't heard piles of reports about that, but there certainly are reports of people who are still climbing now, particularly experienced climbers who are still climbing. The unfortunate thing about that is most of those people are probably not on this meeting right now. They don't usually participate in access calls or Ontario Alliance of Climbers related events and discussions. So unfortunately, our best tool for communicating with those people is our fellow rock climbers. So if you know those people and you feel comfortable and safe approaching them to discuss these kinds of things, then we encourage you to do that, but don't do it if you don't feel safe doing that. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't get those people's ear because they don't typically engage in these kinds of things. So I think if they hear from multiple people that climbing right now is not appropriate, hopefully at some point it will resonate. So if you feel safe and comfortable to do it, please do communicate that it's not appropriate right now.
So
Go ahead,
John.
Yeah, if I can just jump in there. There's been a couple comments on possibly public shaming. I will say, I think the OAC has the position that we do not condone that at all. If you want to have a personal conversation with someone that and that I think throughout this talk, Casey and the OAC board has given a number of different, arguments and angles that you can try to win someone over to your side and explain why we shouldn't be climbing right now. Take on those angles. So, but I think I can speak for all of us when I say that we don't condone public shaming to anybody.
No, absolutely not. I think that's not the road to take here. You're not going to win any friends by taking that direction. I think it's best to have the conversation as respectfully as you can. And if you're in that situation, first of all, and you do say something, I would say good for you for saying something. And it takes a bit of courage to try to figure out how to address something that you're seeing, even outside of this COVID situation. We had this sort of messaging years ago, or a couple of years ago, around, if you see something unsafe, say something. It takes a bit of courage, and I think we did a seminar at the Spring Fling last year around how to approach people from a behavioral standpoint on trying to influence their behaviors positively. The one thing I would say is try to be positive. You're likely not going to win the conversation, but what you might do is have them think twice about that nice person that mentioned it to them last time they were at the crag, or last time they were, caught mentioning that they had been climbing. So
in the end, you can't make people do things. You can just choose who you associate with. And that's kind of how things work, right? You can't make people do something.
I think you just have to pick a sushi.
So I think we can take a few questions. If anyone is interested, you can raise your hand, and I think we should be able to allow you to share. We have one person here, Catherine. I don't know if you're still here, Catherine Gerard. If you're interested, we can just give you a moment here. You're able to unmute yourself, and you should be able to ask your question or make your comment. Catherine, are you there? Maybe we lost her. All right, if we get Catherine back, we can try again. If anyone else wants to raise their hand, you can go ahead and do that. And that'll just give me the ability to unmute you, and then you can make a comment. All right. Oh, no comment. Okay, I see you in the chat there. All right. Oh, we had somebody else, Bonnie Dixon. So I'll just unmute you, Bonnie, and you should be unmuted. You might have to unmute yourself. You can go ahead.
Sure, yeah. Hi guys, thanks for putting this presentation together. I threw the question in the question and answer box here, but I was just wondering, could a permit system for our busy crags be worth exploring after the COVID situation? And if so, could it be helpful to crags which are already under the watchful eye because of the crowding? And have you guys had a chance to talk to maybe other crags that do have permits in place and find out maybe like the pros and cons and what it would be like to implement such a system?
So, I mean, maybe I can speak to that. So I was actually typing something, but here we are. We have been looking at permits for certain Ontario crags, and we haven't talked about it yet publicly, but we are aware of permit systems, and it could be a thing. I'm not sure we would have the capability on our side to implement permits for Mount Nemo. Then it's like, do you want Conservation Halton doing the permit system for you? And maybe we do, maybe we don't. That would be a conversation that we would have to have within our community and also with Conservation Halton as well.
Yeah, so I would add, I mean, we've been exploring a turtle permit system.
You said it. I haven't said it yet.
Yeah, we've said it. No, we've said it. We've talked about this. But if you were at the Real Rock Tour in Toronto, I think we've mentioned it a few different places by now, but a turtle permit system has been in exploration mode for a little while. So that's something that we continue to work on, you know, despite a lot of our activities sort of being put on hold at this point. So yeah, we've certainly been exploring it, and it's something that we're interested in trying to do. I think the question is just that with any of these things, you know, a little bit connected to what Pat was saying is like, if we do start implementing a permit system, then how does that, you know, can we evolve that as COVID restrictions are lifted and over time, you know, I say wishful thinking, if COVID is, you know, a thing of the complete past and we can return to, you know, what we did have before, how would that evolve? So, but yeah, it's definitely something that we've been looking at. And I think it's you know, it's potentially a really good solve for some of these really busy areas. Yeah. Anyone else? All right. So I guess I'll just ask a couple of the questions that I had asked earlier, and then we can probably bring things to a close. But what are some of the things that you as climbers, or we all as climbers, but what are some of the things that you might like to see as part of a access guidelines or climbing guidelines for returning back to the outdoors? If anyone's interested in raising their hand, you can go ahead and do that. I don't see anybody yet. All right. Okay, well, I mean, we talked a little bit about some of the things that we would be exploring, things like recommendations around masks and whatnot. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And if you do have ideas, you know, you can always email us. We've got our info address here on the screen. And you can visit our website in order to ask any questions or get any new information. But if there's nothing else that anyone wanted to share or ask at this time, then I think we can wrap it up here.
Thank you very much, Casey. That was awesome.
Did my best.
Your first ever Zoom hosting.
Yeah, with like 100 people. It's only a little intimidating.
That was great.
139 at the peak.
139.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah, it was very impressive. I think what I was most impressed with was the fact that you said Randy's last name correctly.
I did?
You did, I think.
Oh man. I as soon as I started saying it, I was like, oh man, I shouldn't say this.
I'm impressed. That's all I'm going to say. I'm impressed.
You got 6 syllables in and realized you were committed.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, oh crap, just keep going. Momentum.
Thank you everybody who showed up, and we're overwhelmed with the support. So thank you so much for all the participants that tuned in. And yeah, just wanted to make sure I said that before everybody logged off.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thanks for your patience with me through this. But hopefully we can do something similar to this again soon. I think this was really helpful.
Cool.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.